Happy offseason, Winnipeg Jets fans, and it's not going to be an offseason for much longer as we're rolling up on not only preseason, but the regular NHL season here in a few weeks. But of course, in between, not only are the Jets making moves, but plenty of teams have been trying to load up. And the Pittsburgh Penguins have shocked everyone by acquiring Erik Karlsson. How does this change the rest of the trade market, and what does it signal for the upcoming season? We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, Jets fans, and welcome to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat with any order. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you. Now, moving right along to, of course, the meat of today's episode. Like I said, things might be a little bit quiet with the Jets, but it's certainly not quiet with the rest of the NHL. The league is making moves, and the biggest one, of course, just happened a couple of days ago with the San Jose Sharks trading Erik Karlsson to the Pittsburgh Penguins. And this ended up being a bit of a three-way trade. You know, the Montreal Canadiens got involved, and they netted themselves like a 2025 second-round pick, Casey DeSmith, Jeff Petrie, and Nathan Legare. Obviously, you look at this, and the majority of this whole trade package is just a couple of guys who eat up roster spots and maybe a future to deal with some cap movement. So not a lot from Montreal. San Jose ended up sending, Erik Karlsson, Rem Pitlick, and Dylan Hellebuyck. And then, of course, Pitlick gets, I think, flipped to another team. So, I mean, this is like a strange deal, right? Because what did Pittsburgh actually give up for Erik Karlsson? When you actually look at it, not that much. They traded Jan Rutta, Mike Hoffman, Mikael Granlund, and a 2024 first-round pick in exchange for Erik Karlsson. Now, Karlsson's got several years left on this deal, and I think the important thing to remember is, you know, for the Sharks, right, his contract having like 4 years of term left is kind of an eyesore, especially with a single big cap hit. So there's a couple of ways to skin this cat, and I think the first way that you can kind of look at this is that Pittsburgh won in a massive trade. They're kind of at the end of their core. Crosby, Malkin, that whole team, they really don't have much time left with that core. And if you're basically swinging for the fences, you're cashing in all of your chips, you're selling all of, you know, whatever it is that you think you've got in store. Chasing after Erik Karlsson is a like home run kind of move. But fascinatingly, did not cost them a home run, partly because Karlsson's on the older side. He's got a ton of term. And that contract and cap hit are not great for where he is in his career. All that said, he just put up one of the best seasons we've seen from not only Karlsson, but just an offensive defender in general. Monster season. He's likely to be a huge offensive boost for a Penguins team that, quite frankly, needs the jump. So, you know, in a lot of ways, I think the Pens did really well here. I feel like they didn't give up too much. You know, a 2024 first-round pick is probably nothing to be too upset about. And obviously, Granlund, Rutta, all those guys, not a lot, you know, going for any of them. I think you could consider them almost dead cap in some ways. Players who, you know, do bring some level of value, but nowhere near the kind of value that Karlsson will bring in a predominantly offensive role, especially if he joins the power play, right? This is it's a massive move. This is a game-changing move for the Penguins. Is it going to be enough to save their season? I don't know. That team has a lot of other depth issues that have cropped up over the years, so it's hard to say that this is going to turn their season around. But I think it's interesting to see this from San Jose's perspective because, on the one hand, San Jose kind of got hosed. they really didn't get much in exchange for Karlsson, but I also wonder if they could even demand much because his cap hit's massive. They didn't want to retain salary. And the other situation that you're kind of looking at here is Granlund, Ruta, all of those guys, Hoffman as well, they all expire in 1 to 2 years. So essentially, you just got yourself 2 years of extra cap space, which could be helpful, especially if you want to use that cap space, maybe take on a couple of short-term bad contracts for teams and net some more futures out of it. I feel like if they moved some of those deals that they acquired now already, maybe even eat a little bit of salary, you could potentially add a few more futures or prospects or something to a pool that's, growing slowly. But by the same token, I also kind of wonder, could they have done better? And I still think that's going to be the lingering question that kind of follows Mike Grier around. What is kind of funny is that you now know that, the trade market might be a little bit rough for big deals, and it's probably why the Jets are not going to be able to move Nate Schmidt or Neil Pionk unless they're willing to potentially take a bit of a loss or something, right? For Schmidt's deal, I think you'd have to pay another team to take his salary on. Pionk, I don't know how other teams view him. I think he's kind of, for me, a bit of an unknown. Not that I imagine that the assessment is like glowing right now, but I do wonder if teams still see him as a really good attacking blue liner, right? Somebody with a great shot, a lot of good edge work, a solid passing acumen, and maybe they are willing to overlook some of the defensive issues that he has in exchange for the raw offensive tool set that he brings. But overall, I feel like the trade market is looking not great. I still think the Jets honestly have had the best trade of the entire offseason. I mean, the Dubois thing for the assets that Winnipeg got back, that deal has really aged well. It's continued to age well. It was good when it happened. And I feel like, all I can say is if that's your big takeaway from summer of Chevy, well, you had a pretty okay summer compared to a lot of other teams. Now, obviously, the summer of Chevy could get a lot better if he is able to figure out what to do with the defense. But overall, I can't really complain. I think I look at a lot of these other deals that have gone down, the Karlsson trade and some of the other stuff, and it just seems like it's hard to move salary. It's hard to bring on anyone of quality, and it seems like teams are a little bit skittish around making some big deals. So we'll see if Winnipeg is still in the mood to do something here, especially with Scheifele and Hellebuyck still kind of in limbo. Speaking of which, we're going to talk a little bit about, how quiet it's been with the Jets and whether that's a good sign or maybe something to be a little bit concerned about in just a little bit. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Birddogs. Birddogs are, of course, a super comfortable pair of pants. They've got plenty of types, but, predominantly a lot of folks love their stretch khaki shorts, which are great for, hitting the greens, maybe hitting the town with your friends during summer. They hug your thighs and give you a nice slimmer look and, add a little bit of definition, right? Because who doesn't love showing off some good quads? Birddogs also give you a lot of comfort, and they're made with anti-stink sweat-wicking fabric, so you won't have any of those uncomfortable scents coming down from below. Men, you probably know what I'm talking about. And, of course, as always, they are very stretchy, very comfortable, and they just want to help you not only look good, but feel good. So throw out some of those old stiff cotton shorts that you've got hanging around, the one with like 10 holes that you've held onto for the last 20 years, and opt for a set of Birddogs. And if you're ready to get started, go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free white tech hat with your order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOn or promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free white tech hat. You won't want to take your Birddogs off, I promise you. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us in tonight's episode as we continue to talk about the offseason around the NHL. And more specifically now, we want to focus on Winnipeg's offseason because it's been pretty quiet recently. Obviously, Rasmus Kupari was like the last thing the Jets really did. Winnipeg re-signed him for 2 years at $2 million. We talked about that and why I think he might still be a little bit of a sleeper agent, right? Something for the Jets to consider and maybe munch on, maybe giving him a more prominent role. I think he's still got something to offer the Jets, maybe kind of Morgan Barron style where, the previous organization saw him in a depth role, but maybe he's able to carve out a bigger role, really prove himself in some capacity that's more impressive and earn more ice time. But after that, the big thing right now for the Jets still remains Scheifele and Hellebuyck, and there really hasn't been any movement. The media is dead quiet. it doesn't seem like the Jets are all that actively trading and shopping them. And so it kind of makes you wonder heading into the season, is Winnipeg prepared to just keep them on the team throughout the rest of the year? I feel like it's really going to depend on the playoff seeding, but I also see Winnipeg being very much focused on this idea of trying to convince players like Hellebuyck and Scheifele to resign. I think of the two, Hellebuyck would probably be the guy that I would prioritize resigning, and that's not really a slight on Mark Scheifele. It's more that Hellebuyck is so good at what he does and plays such an elite premium position that I do wonder if he's the guy who makes the most sense, which kind of goes against the common grain of logic. I tend to think, locking in with goalies is complicated. You don't want to commit a ton of cap space to them because at the end of the day, you win a hockey game by scoring goals. And that's where Scheifele really holds a competitive edge. And it's why I think on paper, there's a really solid argument for Scheifele to be the guy that you extend. But I look at it, the relationship side of things, how, Scheifele has been over the past couple of years, and the fact that I don't really know if he's on the same page with management. All of that makes me think that not only would he not really be interested in signing a deal, but honestly, I don't know that the Jets should be all that interested in signing him long-term either. I think both sides kind of need that change in direction, that change of scenery. I feel like you've kind of seen the best of Mark, and that's kind of where it's going to be for the rest of his career if he were to remain in Winnipeg. He's willing to follow leaders and players that he thinks are really setting the right example. And so far with the Jets, I don't really feel that that's really been something that he sees with his team. So it'd be nice if he goes somewhere and really kind of rekindles his passion for hockey. I feel like the past couple of years, there have been some moments where you see him really excited and happy and enthusiastic, but other moments where he just seems to be going through the motions. And I get it. I think in his position, I don't entirely blame him for having the thoughts and feelings that he does, especially with how this team hasn't exactly made the most of his prime. In terms of Hellebuyck, it's a really dicey situation because if you lock in Hellebuyck, you're basically committing to, at worst, mid-level prospect picks if you're in the first round. And if the Jets are trying to think about the long term, it probably behooves them to get higher draft picks by not being as good. And with Hellebuyck, you just can't do that, right? Helly's just too good to be the kind of player who's going to force your team to tank. So, yeah, that's a really tough question. Selfishly, the fan in me desperately wants him to come back on a long-term deal, really wants to see him essentially retire a Jet. I just, I have a really hard time imagining him wearing somebody else's jersey. I've always identified him as a Winnipeg player, as a Jet, as a guy who I thought was going to be getting himself a statue outside MTS one day. Obviously, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but by the same token, the dude is a monster. He seems like he's on a good pathway towards one day ending up in the Hall of Fame as one of the greatest goalies ever. Whether, people will agree with that and really look into the stats enough to see that he's been such a beast for the Jets is debatable, right? But at least in terms of his track record and stuff and a lot of what he's already accomplished, yeah, he is the guy. What I do kind of worry about, though, is that the Jets are going to let all of these questions that I have just sit out there until the trade deadline, maybe end up keeping both players and kind of wondering if they miss the boat at the end of the season when both walk for free. If the Jets somehow hoist a cup out of all of it, I ain't complaining. They can walk and go into free agency, and I really won't care because as long as the Jets get the cup, that's the main thing, right? But if they don't end up being very useful internal rentals, you start to ask questions about the asset management here and whether the Jets kind of overcook their hand. I do worry about that. I'm trying not to think about it too much. Obviously, the season is rolling up, but it is a lingering question. The Jets haven't resolved it, and I'm sure the front office kind of rolls in bed at night wondering the same thing. Are we ever going to sort this out? But it is what it is. At least in the meantime, we've got preseason coming up, and I want to talk about a couple of things that I think I'm really keeping an eye out for preseason just because, this is a great chance for the Jets to kind of hit a reset button, especially after the rather sour and bitter end that last season kind of went out on. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much as we are just wrapping up a few closing thoughts, mainly talking about, the offseason so far. It's been quiet for the Jets, not so quiet for other teams. If you saw that Tom Wilson deal, good Lord, Washington, what are you doing? And then, of course, Erik Karlsson, like we talked about earlier, going to Pittsburgh, big deal for the Pens. The Jets haven't really done anything like that after the Dubois deal, which, fair enough, that's a pretty massive, game-changing, landscape-altering deal for the Jets. But I guess heading into preseason, assuming that this is basically most of what the Jets are planning to do this offseason, preseason has a lot of intrigue this year, in part because Winnipeg is kind of dealing with a number of players and prospects who, quite frankly, have been borderline for a long time. Ville Heinola, I think this is probably his last big chance to show to the brass that he deserves a chance at a full-time NHL role. And even if he had a strong camp, it's hard to imagine the Jets making a spot for him, what with the current roster maybe not being ideal to ship out defenders. They've got some contracts that, quite frankly, are going to be tough to move. Logan Stanley, I think, is another guy that has kind of been on the outs. I really feel like he just needs a change of scenery. I think is what he is. He's a seventh defender. I think, he'd go to another team and essentially be the same thing. I don't think it's going to be like Kovacevic, where he went to Montreal and actually did pretty well. I think Stanley has enough limitations to where what we saw in Winnipeg is basically what you're going to see wherever else he goes. So I wouldn't mind recruiting a pick for him. At this point, I don't even care what it would be. Just find yourself a way to get an asset out of him. I think that's just better for all parties involved, because he's not going to have the role that he thinks he deserves with the Jets. I'd also be curious to know how Chisholm, Heinola, and Sandberg really fight out for those last spots. In my mind, Sandberg is very clearly the choice right now. Heinola would be great on a third pairing role, but I don't really see that happening, in part because there's just no spots. And, would you really be making the most of his puck-moving ability? Probably not. I think you really want him on the power play, and I don't know if Bones necessarily agrees with that yet, so we'll see. Up front, obviously Brad Lambert, I think, is one of the most exciting prospects in the Jets pool, but, his pro tenure so far, at least in North America, has been a little bit modest. Not quite that dissimilar from what happened in Finland, but I will say when he was with the Lahti Pelicans, the Pelicans were just really badly coached, so that could have certainly had an impact. But I think in terms of his first few games with the Moose, I think he's still obviously getting over the adjustment and the North American pro game being a pretty tough one, especially for a teenager. Going to the WHL really definitely, really pushed his confidence forward. I think he'll have a strong camp. I still think he's at least a year away, maybe 2, but if he has a strong preseason and he proves that he's ready to really take on a bigger role with the organization, hey, maybe he makes the team out of camp. That'd be amazing, but I'm not putting stock in it. I think the one thing that I think I would really like to see when it comes to the younger forwards and stuff, though, is who's playing the second line center. Is it going to be Perfetti? Is it going to be Velarde? Who is anchoring that 2C role? Nemesnikov can technically do it, but I don't really feel like a contender should have him in that role. Look, I like Nemesnikov. I think he's a really solid player, but I think you want a little more offensive potential and skill, especially in your top 6, right? Because like Scheifele's probably going to have the number 1 slot unless he gets traded. And then you've got like Ehlers and maybe, I don't know, somebody else anchoring those wing spots. The second line center, then you've got like Perfetti and Velarde. Iafallo at a stretch if you really wanted to do that. I don't really necessarily see that being the case. Iafallo has mostly played out wide recently. I don't even remember if he's like played center on a routine basis all that recently. So, yeah, I wonder. Maybe he's done it with the Kings. I don't recall that closely. I know he has played center at one point, but probably not in a second-line role that the Jets would need to ask of him. So, yeah, Winnipeg has a lot of flexibility up front, but I do sort of wonder how they're going to arrange it. And if Perfetti's able to really become Winnipeg's 2C of the future and perhaps one day the 1C, that's, like, for me, the best-case scenario. I think Velarde would also do a really good job there, but I think in terms of what Perfetti's skill sets bring down the middle versus what his game is out wide, I just feel like he's more naturally suited to the center role, and we know that Velarde's already a really good winger. So, you really can't go wrong. And you also know that at some point, if Velarde sticks around and Scheifele doesn't, well, there you've got Perfetti and Velarde down the middle as your top 6 centers. No questions anymore. So a lot of fun stuff for the preseason Jets to figure out. Preseason really is rolling up here pretty soon. It's not too far from September, so get ready, Jets fans. We are rolling up on the offseason. Give me your most exciting things for preseason that you're hoping for. What are you looking out for? Who are you keeping an eye on? Drop your players to watch or your things to watch and teams to watch in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's show, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. I'll see you back here tomorrow, and we'll also have a quick update on our special guest who, if all goes well, will be joining us next Tuesday. But like I said, for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for having a great night, and see you tomorrow.